All right, welcome back to another episode of I&E Live. My name is Mike Pfeiffer. Super excited to have you here today. In this episode, we're going to be talking about hybrid cloud and multi-cloud. Seems like everybody's talking about multi-cloud these days. I'm joined by Brooks Seahorn, who's an instructor on the cloud team here at I&E, and we're going to have an awesome conversation. So just to remind everybody, we're live streaming across all social media platforms. Go ahead and get your questions ready. And as usual, if you could prefix those with a Q so we can grab them. And feel free to ask, technical questions as much as you want. We're going to break things down in this episode. And I'd like to bring Brooks Seahorn up on the screen here and have him kind of introduce himself. It's been a while since you've been on the show, Brooks. Welcome back.
Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, this is a cool conversation to have about multi-cloud because it's been recent, going in a lot of different directions with the cloud providers, some of them absolutely buying into it and others saying, no, thank you. So I think as we go through this subject, we can hopefully, for our audience, really illuminate some of those areas and point out some of the things from our past, us both being previous AWS employees, my history of working with the DoD cloud and things like that. But I'll bring them some really interesting points on where this may be going.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a fun point. And we talk about that a lot on our team. Both of us have been at AWS in the past. Insanely interesting. So that's definitely going to be some perspective that I'll share as well. It's very cool. So thanks for being here, Brooks.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, awesome. So maybe we could break it down. We've got a lot of people that are learning cloud for the first time. Hybrid is kind of might be a confusing concept. There's all this terminology like public, private, hybrid, multi-cloud, right? Like, let's break it down there before we dive deep into the weeds of multi-cloud.
Yeah, let's do that. First of all, hybrid, I think, is anytime we're talking about a situation where you've got on-prem resources talking to things in the cloud. That's sort of what's become like the standard definition, where, for example, you may be using some compute up in the cloud to run something, but your data store is on site. And the main places I've seen those, Mike, have been where we've had situations where there's been either a regulatory or there's been some sort of compliance about latency, where they just couldn't have it in both places at the same time. And the cloud providers do some interesting things. For example, Azure Stack, AWS Outpost, where you can actually kind of bring a little chunk of the cloud right onto where you are. I think with that one, and I don't know if you've got one that you can mention as a hybrid, but one of my favorites, and I can't name the cruise line, but there's a cruise line out there, and they had the problem of how do we really, really give our, I can't remember the words they used. I think they used the word guests to refer to everyone. Our guests, the best experience in terms of security when they're on the ship. And I believe it's ship. When I was there, I think I said boat, and they made me get up and walk around the building once because it's a no-no. You cannot refer to it as a boat. If I'm saying that backwards, everybody, just sorry. But anyway, they would lose contact with the cloud from time to time as they're out in the ocean somewhere. And so they needed to have those resources on-prem or on ship to make that happen. And that's a great example of what hybrid is. What do you think on that, Mike? Do you have anything kind of fits in that same vein in terms that you've seen in terms of hybrid implementation?
Yeah, I love that. That's an awesome example. One of the places where I was getting pulled into hybrid conversations goes way back to, I guess, 2010. I was doing a lot of enterprise and messaging, like Active Directory and Exchange back in the when everybody was doing VMs and nobody was really talking about cloud. But in that era, like Microsoft started pushing everybody into Office 365, right? Yeah. And that's when I started to take notice of AWS because Amazon had already started, right? Like 2006, 2007-ish. And so when Microsoft was like, hey, we're pushing the email into O365, but we want all you guys to move into this hybrid model, that was the first time it was on my radar. So it was like the email was up there in the cloud, and then everything else was on-prem, right? So that was my first foray into it. And now it's everything. It's not just email. It's like people are doing hybrid and are, got all kinds of stuff on-prem and a mirror of that maybe in the cloud or vice versa. So it's really, kind of interesting. And, same thing with like virtualization platforms. We hear a lot about VMware. Right. And so, to me, some of the stuff that they're doing in the hybrid space has always been interesting. And that's been something that's been that AWS has supported as well. But yeah, that's kind of like when I first got into it. And I'm sure there's lots of stories. So many enterprises are in hybrid model and probably going to be that way for
Hmm.
a while, right?
Absolutely. I mean, there was a customer I'd worked with a while back, and they were basically doing monitoring for industrial equipment. And what they would have is they would have these monitors that you could place on your big industrial equipment, and they would look at things like heat, vibration. They would pull in that data, and but they wanted the machine models on prem. They didn't want it up in the cloud, so they may build the model up in the cloud, but then it was brought on site because there were times that they would again lose contact with the cloud because it was a remote location. In which case, you've got to have that on site. And that's where hybrid really makes sense, where you could lose contact with the cloud, you have a latency issue, or you just have a regulatory issue. It was interesting you mentioned Office 365 because, and I don't know, Mike, you may have to correct me on this. I'm going to jump up on a soapbox, everybody, so just go with me for a second. I do not believe when we say multi-cloud, we mean things like, okay, I've got everything sitting in AWS, but I've got a subscription to Office 365, or I'm using Salesforce. It's like, I don't think that's multi-cloud. That's just
Right.
business as usual is all you're doing. It's really when you see folks like they have a real workload in AWS, a real workload in Azure, something like that. We're going to dive into the weeds heavy on the show. We'll get to it in a moment because you may have already thinking it's not that simple, and you're right, it's not. There's more to it than just throwing a workload out there. But that's always been kind of my definition for that sort of thing, Mike. And I've noticed as an industry, we're kind of moving in that direction and definitely throwing out this idea of if you're consuming some service that's running on cloud, you're not necessarily multi-cloud.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think that some of the stuff that I've seen out there, sometimes some people will categorize multiple clouds being on-prem, hybrid, and public because
Mm-hmm.
you can do private cloud, right? And I
Oh,
just had a
yeah.
conversation earlier with somebody this week that had never heard that term. And we're like, well, what is a
Hmm.
private cloud? And it's just,
Right.
like running VMs on-prem, right? So
Exactly.
technically, I guess you could call that multi-cloud, but that's actually hybrid in my mind. And to your
I'm,
point, when I'm
yeah.
thinking about multi-cloud, it's really that situation where, we're in primarily over in AWS and now like something's over in Azure and we got to figure
Mm-hmm.
that out too. And that brings up a question that I wanted to ask you, which
Yeah.
is, and I've seen this, I'm wondering if you've seen this too. It's like, I think when you see multi-cloud as a term, a lot of people they default to thinking, oh, like I'm trying to spread this workload highly available across multiple clouds. True, that could be one way, but I think really what I've seen multi-cloud so far has
Mm-hmm.
been people like getting, it's just kind of like organically walking into it. Another team is
Yep.
doing AWS and we're doing
Mm-hmm.
Azure. It just kind of happens that way. Is that like something you've seen?
That's quite a bit of what I've seen. I think the one that really got me interested was it was a customer, I believe, in Arizona, and there was like three or four groups all in there that I was speaking to at the same time. And one of them just kind of organically said, speaking of organically, just kind of brought up, "Hey, we're doing that right now in GCP," and literally like, and this was somebody in the back of the room, so like you see everybody just kind of do like that and turn around like, what are you talking about? They said, yeah, we've been in GCP since we got here. What it was is the this particular organization had bought a very small AIML shop, had brought them in. They had been using GCP, so they basically organically just brought GCP right into the organization. So to me, it just seems like it's almost like, and I hate to use the term best of breed. I've never liked that term, but it almost like is a best of breed situation where, hey, we can really do well using like Lambda and AWS. We're using Active Directory for authentication because that's what we've done forever. But at the end of the day, our data scientists are extracting this stuff out to GCP. And I think in those situations, any organization that wants to throw up the multi-cloud flag is absolutely in the right place to do it. But at the same time, I'm very sort of cautious of the CIOs that start saying we're multi-cloud. And it's like, what are you doing? We've got Office. Okay, stop right there. Stop, 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 stop. Back it up. No, it's really understanding, these different clouds. But, and as we go in the conversation, there's a lot of what I call common denominator problems that do exist in multi-cloud that we could also discuss.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah, like there's pros and cons, right, to the whole
Mm-hmm.
conversation. Which that kind of takes me to a point that I wanted to bring up with you. Speaking of the whole AWS thing, right, between the two
Yeah.
of us, there was some, some outages at the end of the last year with AWS, leading into the
Hmm.
holidays. There's a lot of pressure. Amazon's grown a lot since both of us have
Yes.
worked there, obviously.
Yes.
And I saw an article go by a little bit after some of those incidents where, people are talking about, hey, you could do multi-cloud to, kind of hedge these issues by, being pinned on one vendor. That's a fair
Hmm.
conversation, but there was an article that came out. I don't know if it was from AWS. I don't think it was, but it was
Hmm.
basically saying, hey, if you architect things the way that AWS tells you to from a DR disaster recovery
Right.
perspective,
Right.
you shouldn't necessarily need multi clouds to close the gap on being stuck with one vendor. Could you explain what they were talking about a little bit in that piece?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Like the composition of the geography, if you want to think of it that way, of AWS is obviously there's the data centers that we really don't talk about, but we talk about like availability zones that are a part of our VPC, and that we break it into regions as well. The idea of the data center, pardon me, the availability zones is this: if you've got your workload spread across two different AZs, there should be some geographic distance between those two, some little bit of distance. And that's the idea of, if there's a fault line, for example, AWS will literally take that into consideration. They'll look at the geography of the place and make sure if something happens here, it shouldn't happen there. And if you build across those AZs, yeah, you're kind of getting a little bit of fault tolerance. Now, I know, and I'm not. Don't think I'm picking up my pom poms and doing my AWS rah rah. Everybody, I'm not doing that. It's the fact. If I go back in my career, let's just say 10, 15 years, the idea of being able to easily do that it was hard. Like I just couldn't easily. This time I was with the DoD, two different DISA locations, for example, or two different, placement locations. That was hard to do. I can do it in AWS like that now. And then I can spread it to the point of saying, okay, fine. If I want to take the next step, I can now break my workload across regions and then use something like DNS. Like Route 53 is very good for this. You could tell Route 53, look, send half of my DNS requests to Ohio, send the other half over to Oregon. And if you ever see this go to, not responding, then send everything over here 100%. And yes, you can do that. But here's the thing: nothing's free, y'all. Nothing is free. You've got to pay for it somehow. So you are adding a little more complexity to your rollout. It's going to be a little more difficult to work with. You've got to think as an architect a lot more. You just can't slam stuff out there. You've got to think big picture. I don't know about you, Mike, but I've always thought of architecture as, some people say it's the art of finding, the lesser of things, trying to find that perfect compromise. I always said it's the person who's most likely to get yelled at for mistakes, because it's going to be on the architect. The developers are like, here's the requirements. I know this thing can do this. Now you go do all the things that are going to support my requirements. So
That's
it's a
true.
tough thing to get right, a tough thing to do. But I think they do have a place they can make that argument to people to say, hey, if you spread it across, you can get a much higher level of disaster recovery. Now, when we start talking about multiple cloud vendors, here's the thing. If there is an outage like we saw last month or a month ago or so in AWS, being able to go between different cloud providers, doing a weighted routed DNS type thing across there, that's very doable. But here's the thing: how are you going to pay for that? Because you're going to pay for it. I'm not necessarily talking about money. I'm talking about complexity. So that's one of the things that you've got to do when you're thinking about going multi-cloud. It's like you've got to find that balance, because at the same time, particularly if you realize that you have a really, really in-depth, deep down architecture in AWS where you're using like Lambda to talk to SNS, SES, SNS, talking to Event Bridge, you're doing all sorts of things like that. That could be a hard thing to extract out and then put over into a different cloud provider. Even if you're using something like Terraform that gives you some sort of agnostic capability, those templates are going to have to be different. And if you can do that, that's great. But the way you're going to do that is by finding people that understand more than one cloud and don't have a problem. They say, oh, yeah, I know AWS, I know Azure, I know GCP, I know how to set that up. And that's why, here at INE, it's one of the reasons why I'm excited to be here, is we're starting to move in that direction very, very consciously to say, how can we give people that capability? Because, I don't know about you, Mike. Maybe you can tell me. I've always been very leery as a business person saying we've only got one source for something. That scares me a little bit. It's like, wait a minute. I don't care how reliable they are. That sounds like I've just painted myself into a corner.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point because as architects, ultimately our job is to eliminate single points of failure, right? I mean, that's
Mm-hmm.
kind of the big idea. And so one of the things I heard there that I think is key is complexity.
Mm-hmm.
And because just to your point, I remember back in the old days when we were doing physical infrastructure, and if somebody wanted to do a, kind of a warm standby site or active
Yeah.
passive
Mm-hmm.
or West Coast, East Coast kind of thing,
Yeah.
in the physical world, man, it was just like millions of dollars of investment, months or maybe years of work in the field. And even then, like once you got it all going, the complexity could kill you, right? So that's what I wanted to take this to next, which is like people need to have the operational maturity at a team level to pull some of these things off, right? So I think what I'm hearing in this conversation so far is kind of like there's the business perspective of are we using multi-cloud for, kind of trying to do this highly available thing, or are we just doing multi-cloud to compose an architecture with the right services? And some of those might come from different platforms. So there's the business aspect, and then there's the individual, which you touched on as well, which,
Mm-hmm.
you're that's a different mindset, right? Of building your multi-cloud skills to be able to contribute to IT teams today.
Exactly, exactly. It's funny you mentioned that because literally as you were talking just then, I heard the echoes of we're going to be cloud first. I'm like, that's not a strategy. That's a neat end goal, but that's not a strategy. And so, when you go to the cloud, you have to be very purposeful. You got to know what's going on. And when you get more and more into organizations that are going to, again, organically have multiple cloud providers working workloads, you've got to have members on your team that understand this, and this is not just from an architectural, this is also security. This is also your operations desk, for example. There's a big push right now between some of the cloud providers to come up with sort of, I guess, what they want to call like their one view on monitoring, which is I think is when they're starting to move this idea of open telemetry, where it doesn't matter what cloud provider, as long as they conform to the open telemetry rules, you can have tools that can bring that in and look at it, and that's fine. That's a great idea. And to that fact, it's kind of like I don't know. It didn't make as much noise as it should have, Mike. Like it was like this explosion that happened underground, and nobody paid attention to it. But Microsoft came out just in December with some updates to Cloud Defender, and one of those updates was you can now do compliance checks on your AWS resources, which was kind of like, whoa, hold on there, sport. Are you serious? And sure enough, if you look in the Azure portal, that's exactly what you can do. So when you have a person sitting there, for example, we're talking about the actual person and what they know, they've suddenly actually got, whether they like it or not, a multi-cloud tool in this Microsoft Defender, but they still need to understand AWS. There's going to be implementation details over there on that side that you need to understand, even though you're working predominantly in Azure. And I guess on that whole thing, it comes down to that whole maturity thing, Mike, the operational maturity. That is, in comes the ticket to the desk. Does the desk have the knowledge of going, that's AWS, that's Azure, that's somewhere in between, and having the knowledge to be able to really be effective in that particular space?
Yeah, very true. And the reason I asked that too, or one of the reasons, is when I was working with customers, even just as early as 3 years ago, these conversations about multi-cloud would come up. And usually it would come up in a situation where the operational maturity wasn't even there for one cloud, right? And so
Right.
I used to tell people, you need to get good at one before you start thinking about two,
Yeah.
right? So I would tell them that
Right.
all the time. And I kind of feel like that's similar maybe for somebody learning, maybe, right? I don't know. We've talked in the past about kind of having an anchor, like being really strong in one. And then once you have that, the second one gets easier to learn. What are your thoughts from an
Mhm.
individual practitioner's perspective? Because the common question is like, which one do I pick? Is it
Right.
AWS, Azure, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I can't agree more, man. I mean, like if you're gonna if you have no cloud skills, and let's say like you want to specialize in security or something like that, pick one and get good at it. Because a lot of the same concepts are going to carry over. It's just going to be a different service name. It's going to have a few different tweaks into it. So yeah, you get good at one, you really build up that maturity, and then and this is the kind of the thing for me, Mike. When you start getting into complexity, when it starts getting complicated, having that broad knowledge is going to pay off like you wouldn't believe, in being able to say, particularly in a complex, chaotic situation, no, 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 this isn't that complicated. It's really simple. It's a 1, 2, 3 XYZ problem. This is what we need to do to be able to solve this particular problem. So I really think that for anyone who's interested in the space, do that. Pick a cloud provider, AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever the case may be. Get good with it. Like, really feel comfortable with it. But then stretch out, because I'm going to warn you, this is something I've seen a lot, Mike, and I almost want to zip my mouth and not say anything about it. If you don't do that, you will become almost tied to a particular provider. Like, you'll just go Azure, Azure, Azure. For like, Azure will become the solution to everything. It's like having somebody working on a car with you, and their solution is the first thing that they do is grab the hammer. It's like, hold on, I don't think that might not be the right tool. Let's step back for a second. So yeah, I agree, man. I mean, what's your experience been in terms of maturity and the ability to handle complexity as a function of sort of how many cloud providers do you have at least a proficiency with?
Yeah, it's so interesting, that question, because I would teach like live classes several years ago, 20,
Mm-hmm.
25 people in the room. And you'd have mostly, the most of the room would be very, very green because it was so early,
Mm-hmm.
right? But every once in a while, I would get somebody from a huge enterprise, I remember one time I had a national insurance company, or a guy from a national insurance company, and he was sitting in the
Yeah.
last row, but he was like, he knew a ton of
you
stuff. Like, he was just
you
kind
can
of like,
always
oh,
you can always spot them, man. It's that
right.
that one guy, that one woman you look at and you go,
Yeah.
let me be
But
careful here. They may know
yeah.
something.
So every once in a while, I get somebody like that, and they'd be like, explaining to me how they're doing all these advanced things. And
Mm-hmm.
generally, it's always a larger enterprise, right? They're bigger.
Right.
They got more bodies, right, to throw at
Mm-hmm.
things. They got more expertise on the team where they can mentor other people, and
Right.
so, and I've worked as a sysadmin at places with 300-400 users, right? And that's a very
Mm-hmm.
different story from an IT operations maturity perspective versus a national insurance company with 500 people in the IT organization just by itself. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
I think
exactly.
size of company, can sometimes be a factor. But I think as time goes on, what we're going to see happening, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is that people will become more proficient even at the lower level, right? And even at the small company level, they're going to become proficient with cloud because the ecosystem, at least that's what I think, the ecosystem is going
Mm-hmm.
to support cloud more than anything else, probably in the long term.
Absolutely. It was always said that eventually we would get to a place where cloud was default. It wasn't even cloud first. It's like, oh, we're going to start a project. The next question is, well, where do we want to deploy this? Do we want to use AWS, Azure, GCP, whatever? And so I think even at the most fundamental levels, it's going to be a big, big requirement, because you just don't know where you may be going next in the cloud, or who may be the next big player, or what may be the next big technology that you're going to be using inside the cloud. So having that strong fundamental skill in more than one provider, I think for anybody who has that, if you're at a job interview, you're going to be the one who could really say so, because it could be the most offhand comment. And I think that's one of the things that got me, Mike, about these offhand comments I've seen when I was interviewing people. And I would say, how would you do this in AWS? Da 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 da. And they would answer, and they say, oh, by the way, there's a really cool way to do this in GCP. And you go, oh, okay, that's kind of cool to know that there's that other capability, because it's tantamount, Mike. I don't know if you remember this commercial, and I don't even remember who it was for, but there's like this big boardroom, and there's people sitting all around the table, and there's the CEO. He comes marching in, he sits down. Okay, he goes, okay, what's the problem today? Do we have a database problem? Do we have a networking problem? And this one sort of youngish guy goes, it's about, and he holds up in his hands a shirt. He goes, it's about the new shirt, sir. We make shirts. It was that whole thing about, they got so obsessed with the IT department, they forgot what they were really doing. And so I think it's incumbent upon folks like us that are in this space to be good enough to allow them to do what they do that makes the company great, do that product. And we've got the skills across the board so it doesn't, bubble up and become a problem. That said, that is not an excuse for CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, middle managers, all the way down, not to be cloud versant. That's not an excuse. You should be able to talk cloud a little bit, but at the same time, being multi-cloud is going to be a big deal coming up at any level in the IT organization. I would say within the next 2 to 3 years, easily will be a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. It's already getting lots of brand recognition out there. I'm just seeing it so much being talked about.
Right.
And one of the things I'd like to talk about as well. I mean, obviously there's tons of benefits, but there's also some cons, right? So let's talk about
Hmm.
that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to let everybody else out there know we're ready to answer your technical questions. So throw them into the chat, whether you're on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, doesn't matter. We'll bring up your questions and answer them. I'm going to go to Jason's question. Jason had a question, and this will help us kind of answer some of these questions a little bit better and frame up
Okay.
this idea a little bit better. Jason says, if I understand you, consuming a service from the cloud and running a workload in the cloud is the difference in cloud versus multi-cloud. And
Hmm.
so we bring that back up just to kind of
Yep.
make sure we can get Jason some clarity here. So he's saying consuming a service from the cloud and running a workload in the cloud is the difference, cloud and multi-cloud.
Ooh, I see where Jason's going with this. Great question, Jason. By the way, never tell anybody they've had a great question, but that's a great question because look at what he's saying right there. Running a okay, consuming a service in the cloud. That's exactly it, Jason. That you've hit it right on the head. Because in a lot of times you don't even know you're consuming a service from the cloud. All we have is this front end that we're using. It could even be an API at a programming level. But typically it's something like Salesforce, Office 365, whatever the case is. Yes, technically it's running in the cloud, but I don't think that we get I don't want to say the privilege or the right to say we're multi-cloud just because of that. It doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. So yeah, that's a really good way to do it to understand it, Jason. And I think you're right. For me personally, that is a big difference. That absolutely is the difference between we are multi-cloud. We are different clouds versus, oh, I'm consuming this thing over here that just happens to be hosted in the cloud. And therefore, I want to raise the multi cloud flag, and I don't think it holds water. But again, IMO, okay?
Yeah, I mean, the industry is still inventing this concept too, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of definitions from different people, and but let's go back to the cons, and we'll bring up some more questions here in just a second. So,
Okay.
to me, one of the I talked about one that I felt passionately about, which is operational maturity. And I
Mm-hmm.
also think
Mm-hmm.
that it's going to be a lot more difficult if you're not doing cloud native implementation, and that's probably something we need
Yeah.
to unpack as well, right? Because
Yeah.
if I'm doing VM architecture from 2010, I'm going to struggle a lot more than I'm doing Kubernetes and multi-cloud, right?
That's right. And it's almost like a good friend of mine, Steve, likes to say, don't build your data center in the cloud. It's like, right. Don't rebuild your data center in the cloud. You need to be, sort of more cloud centric. So, yeah, I agree with that. Absolutely. Um, on that question, can you kind of explain that a little bit more, Mike? Because there's something you're saying there I want everybody to hear very clearly.
Yeah. So let's go back to where we're at. Was that a question that I took from the audience?
No, it's just something you threw out. The idea of, I think it was about the complexity, in dealing with it
Oh,
and
right.
stuff like that, because to me, that is it. That is absolutely it. It's like everybody just wants to say complexity and let it go. It's like, no, 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 no. You don't quite get it. When we're talking about complexity in particular, understand that you may necessarily, accidentally, truncate your ability in the cloud when you go multi-cloud. And this is in this con conversation that Mike and I are having. When you go multi-cloud, because if I'm just AWS, I can really dive into the services that are available and really do remarkable things. However, if I want to be able to put that workload in both of them, I have to find a common denominator. I can't go full in on both sides. They may have similar services. In most cases, they do, but I can't go like really in. And I'm not going to knock AWS here. I love AWS. I think they're awesome. But you will hear that sort of conversation as the anti multi cloud conversation right there saying, don't you want to be like company X over here? Bring my finger in, company X over here, because they're going so fast. They're so innovative. They're so cool. They're the one all the kids want to be like. And they're all in AWS, Azure, GCP, and they can go really, really fast. Okay, albeit that is a great point. That really is. However, again, I cannot get around that gut feeling of, as a business person, single sourcing anything whatsoever can necessarily put me in a corner. So I want to have that ability to go to other providers if necessary for whatever reason may be there. And it could be best of breed. It could be because I need to avoid vendor lock-in. There actually could be a regulatory concern where, for example, AWS has regulatory compliance in writing and another provider is not there yet. So you want to be able to move between these clouds. Yes, there's going to be a complexity. Absolutely, it's going to be there. But we as engineers, students, fanatics for all things tech, we can handle that. We can learn these things. We really can.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I see what you're saying there. I think the one where I got lost, I was reading questions and I got kind of confused. Going back to what I was saying about one of the cons, I think potentially, right, is depending on the architecture that you're trying to wedge into this multi-cloud conversation. If you're doing
Yeah.
things that are completely bleeding edge, brand new, you're doing Kubernetes and you're containerizing all of your apps. I mean, it's
Mm-hmm.
fairly easy to do that on multiple. The struggle that I see, especially I've worked with so many Windows enterprises over my career. I still know so many people and spent so much
Right.
time in there. Like taking a
Same
Windows VM,
here.
right, and then like
Yeah.
trying to replicate it exactly on Azure and AWS. There's a lot of differences, right? But when I containerize an app, it's just like I could just run it
Mm-hmm.
in there almost. But there's data challenges across clouds. And
Oh,
I think that we're a little early on the whole conversation of, hey, I'm going to take my app and I'm going to spread it across Azure and AWS. And if Azure fails, it's going to, fail over seamlessly to AWS. Because I
yeah,
just don't think that, I mean, I think we'll get there eventually. I think there will
I
be
do.
tools and services that lay on top of this stuff that make it easier.
Mm-hmm.
But I
I do
think that
too.
people fear multi-cloud and think that, right, is the only thing. And I don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But talking about what you're talking about, particularly with data is the one that freaks me out more than anything else because what bites people about cloud is going to be the billing, and they're not going to realize, okay, if I want to replicate my data set between Azure and AWS so that I can really, I mean, that's what it's about. It's about data, y'all. You've got to have your customers up to date. You've got to have their orders up to date. You got to have all this stuff up to date on both sides of the cloud, or you got to make calls across cloud to get back to that data that's sitting over and saying AWS RDS or something like that. You will get charged for that. You will get charged for that right there. And so that's something you really need to consider and you really need to think about because you need to take in the totality of if we're multi-cloud, I've got to do the work twice.
Yeah.
Everything has to be replicated. So if I'm running 100% to AWS, I've got to take the same update and push it over to Azure. And I've got to keep it kind of going like that. It almost becomes, if you do it like that, like the cold standby, where you could,
Hmm.
or pardon me, the warm standby, where you could bring it up to full or hot, hot. But if you're going to do hot, hot, again, we got a money issue here. So you've got to find that place, man. That's the conversations I've had with people about multi-cloud has been that you've got to find that place where your RTO, your RPO, for those of you who are not familiar with RTO, RPO, it says how much data can you lose? How long can you be down? Those are the questions. And if implicit in that is, what if this cloud provider goes down? Then how much money can you spend is going to have to come up for you to meet your RTO, RPO requirements.
Totally agree. That was a great answer, Brooks. Really like that one. Got a couple related questions I want to touch on. So one from Larry. He says, from a learning perspective, how deep would you go in each cloud, and also how many cloud platforms, two or three? So I think we kind of talked about this before, but I also think this piggybacks well on what you were saying, Brooks. There's like so many hidden things if you're not
Oh, yeah.
solid on just one cloud, like data transfer, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get
Mm-hmm.
caught not understanding all of the, kind of ways things work. And next thing you know, you're on Reddit talking about how you have a $20,000 cloud bill, right? um, so,
25,000, 250,000.
yeah, we see that, right? So, like, you definitely need to get good with one. How many? In my opinion, I would cross train on one. So I would have like an anchor cloud where it's like, all right,
Right.
I'm going to get good on AWS. I'm going to get good on Azure. And then I
Mm-hmm.
would cross train just for my own awareness. And I would just map what I'm learning in one to the other. So, for example, Azure
Mm-hmm.
virtual machines, I got really good at Azure virtual machines. Now, how do I apply all the things that I've learned over in AWS EC2? And how do I figure out like how they do that kind of stuff? That's what I think is cross
Yep.
train when you have time. And it just, I say this all the time, but it reminds me of like learning JavaScript. And then now you go learn PHP and you're like, oh, I totally get this.
Right. Right, exactly. And I like your scenario about, do VMs here, do VMs here, do serverless compute here, do serverless compute here. That way you understand both of them. Larry's question about how deep you would go. That's a tough one to answer because I don't really know how to give you like a dimension into depth of complexity into any cloud provider whatsoever. I would say this. There's the big areas: compute, storage, networking, stuff like that. You definitely want to be strong in those areas. So look at the virtual machines, look at how they host databases, look at how they do their basic networking, things along those natures of that nature, and security. Make sure you understand their security model and what they're doing. That would, to me, would be like a great starting place to go between two different cloud providers. And then you could always come back and start diving into things like, how do they handle messaging? What special services do they have for streaming? How do they handle IoT and stuff like that? Those are always really good things. But if you do like the compute, storage, networking, security, that would be a really good depth to start with.
Yeah, and this is a good opportunity for me to plug in a commercial here if I can.
Yes.
I think Larry, just so you know, the stuff that we're building on the cloud team, Brooks and I and Matt Davis and the other folks that are joining soon, we have a big focus of helping you be proficient in a single vendor, but also all the way up to multi-cloud. So we're going to be creating content and scenario-driven labs where you're not just memorizing information, you're learning how to build projects. And that's really what the industry is going to need, is somebody that can jump in there, be good at one cloud, and then get into a scenario where it's like, how do I figure this out over in AWS or Azure, right? And we're going to help with that. That's this kind of stuff we're going to build. I think, Brooks, you probably experienced this as a trainer in the past. You can only take people so far where you're just like feeding them steps or like, just raw facts. At some point, you got to cut them loose and let them build on these platforms, right?
Yes. You've got to. I mean, it really bothers me that at any time whatsoever, you can fill somebody's head with a bunch of facts, or they can go do a certification that really is a trivia challenge. It's really what it is. It's just a trivia challenge. Hey, you need to do this thing. Like you need to run a NoSQL database in Azure. Which one do you pick? That's not quite good enough. Like you really need to think about it from a scenario based. You need some hands-on skills with it. You need to really dig in a little more than just learning a few facts about a provider. That's not going to do you any good. Matter of fact, that could actually make you, almost dangerous to yourself. Versus if you go into a situation where you've been hired as a engineer and they say to you something along the lines of, okay, clone down this Terraform template. We're going to use this to build up a VPC so our engineers can experiment with something new. Go do that. That is going to blow up 90% of the people's minds that are new to cloud because they're going to have no idea what to do. We're not going to do that. That is not what this is about. This is about giving you the hands-on, real-world experience that you're going to need to be able to walk into those places and be effective, really be effective, and set yourself apart in the marketplace as well.
So true. That piggybacks on another question that was in there that I wanted to bring up from Jozak. He said that the pace it with, oh wait, there's a different question of his. Wouldn't multi-cloud have a lot more overhead and learning curve than sticking to a single vendor? And I would agree in the short term, but like your career is a long career and the industry is moving towards a situation where multiple clouds are going to always be in the conversation. So what I think is that, yes, in the time being, learning, getting good with one cloud should be your focus, right? You should be building that skill set on the first one, and then you can start cross training. And that's exactly kind of like what we have planned on our team. But in general, anybody could do that, right? Like you get good with one, and then you graduate, right? You start moving your way up. You go from an engineer to an architect to a DevOps engineer, maybe.
Absolutely.
If you want to follow that path, right?
Yeah.
So it's very incremental.
Yeah, exactly. Jozak, that's exactly it. That's exactly like if I was mentoring you, that's exactly what I would tell you is like, look, get good at one, but then move out. It's kind of like you had an earlier question, Jozak, about like Oracle, IBM, and Alibaba. Will they ever get any recognition anytime soon? if when you go multi-cloud, when you understand more than one particular cloud, you can be as you know, as Mike was saying, you're going to move from being like the help desk to being the engineer to being the architect. It's when you step into that architect role and you've been building that multi-cloud skill set over a period of years, that when you move into that, you can start saying the things that could really change for the better the way an organization is going, by being able to say, hey, I think Oracle's got a really cool setup for this one particular thing. Maybe we should take a look at that. And again, if if you go through a 5-year career, Jozak, and all you did was just AWS, that's all you're going to do. I wouldn't want you to do that. Become a consumer of lots of different clouds, 2 to 3 clouds. Know what they're doing. But again, start with the one. Get really good with one. That way you can go out and grab that career. You can jump into cloud engineering. You can start really getting that real world experience that you're going to need, and then be able to talk about the other clouds as well. It can make a big difference to how an organization operates, and a big positive difference to your career as well.
Thanks, Brooks. I'm glad that you brought that up because I saw that question go by earlier, and I'm like, gosh, a great question. So that's really cool. There's so many other platforms out there in addition to this list too that I like as a individual. So if you're like working on your own, like DigitalOcean and Linode, and there's so many. So yeah, I mean, it's like there's going to be a place for those. It's going to happen, and I think it'll be interesting to watch as we go on in the industry. I think other vendors will start to pop up, new tools and services. I've seen some really cool stuff that's being built on these cloud platforms. So that's what a lot of times SaaS platforms are built on top of these other cloud platforms. For example, Dropbox, right? When we all know they were famously using Amazon for so long, right? So
until they figured out a better way to do storage, which was absolutely amazing that they did that. It was like, wow, you came up with a better way to do storage? That's amazing. But the thing I like about your question, Jozak, about Oracle, IBM, Alibaba, it goes to the multi-cloud conversation. If you go and look at Oracle's, for example, I'm picking on Oracle here, but if you go to Oracle's documentation, you will see they flat out talk about their pin down points with Azure, because they know that people want to use Microsoft's Active Directory for their authentication authorization. But you're going to continue to use that Oracle database because that's what the program is used forever. There's a lot of, particularly like in the US government, they use Oracle databases for compliance reasons. So again, this is getting back to the multi-cloud scenario, really knowing Azure, for example, knowing it really well is great. And then once you've got that core knowledge, going ahead and picking up, say, your knowledge on Oracle or something else, that's where these little things will happen in your career, Jozak, where you're like, hey, we need to start using Oracle. And you go like, yeah, I've used OCI a couple of times. I get it. I know how to do it. What's your question? That's a pretty big deal.
Yeah, I totally agree. I was laughing there at the end because I saw a question come in from Casey Wood. What's up, Casey?
Hey, Casey.
He said, do you think cloud providers will ever accept cryptocurrency as a payment for services?
Let's see. Let me check. Hang on. Let me check my crypto right now and see how it's doing. Oh,
I know, right? Yeah, we're riding a wave over here on the crypto train. It's like it's kind of an emotional ride, if we're all honest.
It is.
But,
do you know?
Honestly, maybe. Right?
I think, Casey, what I love about that question is this. Okay, I'm going to be very specific, and I'm going to go full confession here. I'm a developer on the Near network. I write Rust code. Anyway, here's the thing about it, Casey. I can use that network as long as I've got some Near tokens in my account. I can actually put a contract out there on the chain. I can interact with it and stuff like that. I really like the idea of some sort of denomination of cryptocurrency so that I could create some, say, executable type thing that could run in Lambda. And the way I will do it is not by signing up for an account with AWS and blah, 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 but I can simply, via crypto, execute that code on a blockchainish type thing that'll actually go to Lambda. That could be very interesting. So I could see that happening in the future. Now, there's a huge conversation about what is Web3 going to be. I'm sorry, everybody. I know we're going off the thing. We'll come back. The Web3 being sort of like WebAssembly and your storage compute will be blockchain. What I think is this: in the interim, just like a minute ago in 2007, 8, and 9, when I wouldn't dare put my compute in the cloud, but S3 was kind of cool, and I end up being on-prem and in the cloud, hybrid, I could see this same thing happening with a Web 3.0, where I'm fronting a lot of stuff in cloud, but then my backside could be like blockchain sort of things. And at that point, Casey, yeah, I think they might start accepting it. But please, I'm no financial advisor. I can give you no financial advice. This is just
Yeah.
blah.
Yeah, and don't get any crazy ideas, everybody, about trying to mine crypto to pay for your cloud bill. That's probably not a good thing to get into.
Don't do
Um,
it. Don't
we
do
have
it.
one
Walk
last
away.
question that I want to hit, and I want to get your final thoughts, Brooks, as we start to
Okay.
wrap this up. So,
Okay.
Larry was asking about one of these new certifications coming out that we're working on. So we have announced the ICCA, which is an associate level certification. And then from there, we're going to be building all kinds of stuff. So it's a little bit early for us to start saying when that's coming out, but we've
Right.
announced the ICCA that's going to have hands-on lab validation. That's an associate level certification for anybody in the IT business. Okay. So we'll be, that's been announced. You can start going through the content right now. We're building the certification where you'll actually take the exam and you'll go through some high level hands-on exercises. And then from there, Larry, to answer your question, Brooks and I and everybody else, Matt on the cloud team, we're building some insanely cool content that are going
Mm-hmm.
to serve these certifications at different level, like engineer, eventually architect, DevOps engineer, and those kinds of things. So as you guys, and as everybody, I should say, is working to build up their cloud skills and get, certified, we're going to be building content that's going to take you to the next level on the way, right? So this is going to
Right.
be something that we're doing together. And I hope you guys are coming along for the ride with us. But on that note, Brooks, any final thoughts as we start to wrap this one up?
I think the thing that for anybody else I would say is this: get hungry about learning and don't let it go. I am flipping 52 years old, y'all. I've been doing this since 1992 or 3, right after I got my degree in chemistry and realized I hate chemistry. And so I've been in this business. It's going to keep changing, but here's the interesting thing about it. The stuff keeps coming back. The same ideas keep coming back. If you get the foundational skills, the things that we're going to try to teach you via this INE certification, once you get those fundamentals, you will find yourself in a really interesting place where going forward, these skills just keep snowballing and snowballing and snowballing into greater capability. And we are going to try to keep this stuff as real world as possible, fun, interesting, different. So as you go into our training, if you start going, wow, this is strange, yeah, there's a reason for it, because that's what we need to really create great learning experiences for you. And I can't tell you how excited I am, Mike, to be doing this. This is going to be flipping cool.
It's going to be insanely cool. Brooks Seahorn, everybody. Brooks, thanks so much for being on the show today. Really appreciate it.
Hi,
Everybody,
everybody.
that takes us to the end of this INE Live episode. I feel like I've been monopolizing the show lately, so we'll have a new team on the show next week. But thanks for being here, as usual. And don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll see you on the next episode.